I'm recording. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We are in our webinar regarding assessing for substantial disability. This webinar will be presented by our very own Dr. Barbara Johnson, our clinical psychologist. Before I give the floor to her, just a little bit of Zoom guidelines here. So we are on a webinar platform, so you won't see your video and you won't be able to speak, but please use the Q&A button below if you have any questions or comments. Vicky Fisher is here with us, and so she will help us navigate through the Q&A. And if there's any questions, she will then bring it up to Dr. Johnson. Later, we will have some polls. We are highly encouraging everyone to participate in answering those polls. It's just a question and answer thing. You pick your answer, nothing to be worried about. It's going to be anonymous, and so we won't know who answered which one. But we will know in the end how many people answered a certain topic, if it's letter A, B, or C. So it's something for us to learn. So we're encouraging everyone to participate on the polls. And then this webinar is being recorded. Once we have the link, it will be posted on our Inside Exchange for staff to review again at a later date if you want to watch it again, or for those of your coworkers who are not here, not able to attend, then please feel free to let them know that this is going to be available on Inside Exchange and they can view it at a later date as well. I think Dr. Johnson is planning on sending out a guideline for those that attended. I don't have a list of the attendees, but definitely we'll have you email Vicky if you wanted a copy of that guideline, and then she will give you a copy of that. But that's probably going to be in a couple of days or so. Okay, so now without further ado, I will present to you Dr. Johnson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with me this afternoon. It's a long training. Normally, we would have a break, but unless there's any objections, I'd like to power through, and we will continue. So it may take us the full time that we've allotted, which is until 4 o'clock. However, there's also the possibility that we may finish up sooner than that. So again, today's topic is assessing for substantial disability. I know that many of you have attended a similar training that I've had on this topic. It's been several years now, but there's also, the reason why we're doing this training is because we have a number of new staff who've not attended the training, and I also felt that it was good to have a refresher. Because when we first presented it, it was about just rolling it out about the substantial disability. So for those of you that may be unaware, the reason why this was put together, this was a coordinated document that we put together with regard to the guidelines that was developed by the ARCA psychologists. And so we have the guidelines that Claire had mentioned to you that will assist you when you're either doing an intake or you're preparing for an IEP, or if someone who is going to be undergoing a redetermination of eligibility. So that's why, as you can see on the slide, who should attend? It really involves a lot of different individuals. It's not just for intake, it is for case management. It's also for the eligibility review team members, eligibility appeal team members, and even our vendors. Because what we want is we want people to be able to know what is it we're looking for when we're talking about substantial disability, what do we mean by that, and where should it be documented. So what does the law say about substantial disability? That's based on Welfare and Institution Code 4512A-L. So substantial disability means the existence of a significant functional limitation in 3 or more of the following areas of major life activities, as determined by the regional center and as appropriate to the age of the person. Why we say it's appropriate for as determined by the regional center is because it's also important for individuals to understand that the regional center, just like a school system or Social Security, they all have their inclusion and exclusion criteria, and the regional center is no different. So what might be a qualifying condition, or what might be identified as substantial disability for, say, the school system may not necessarily be the same definition as the regional center. Many of you are aware we do have 7 areas of substantial disability, and as you can see, it is based on age. So, for example, we wouldn't be looking at economic self-sufficiency for someone if they are 4 years old. We wouldn't be thinking that they would be attending vocational training, or that they would have employment, or that they would have the capacity to live independently. So again, it is determined by age. I also wanted to share with you what you'll see at the bottom of this slide, where it indicates any reassessment of substantial disability for the purpose of continuing eligibility. The Lanterman is very clear. It says that you shall utilize the same criteria under which the individual was originally made eligible. Again, Welfare and Institution Code, this is 4512-2. This means in the event of a redetermination, you must consider the year in which the consumer was found eligible. So for example, in 2001, Welfare Institution Code 4512L was actually non-existent, and the only exclusion was physical conditions. It's also good to know that any reassessment of substantial disability, of looking at it historically. So in 2005, the Lanterman Disability Service Act and related laws, they spoke to the required 3 areas of substantial disability. That's the first time that Lanterman, if you look at the different Lanterman editions throughout the time, it's the first time that it actually includes the 3 areas of substantial disability. Instead, it's Title 17, the California Code of Regulations 54,000, which speaks to 3 areas of exclusionary conditions that we know, which are solely psychiatric disorders, learning disabilities, and those that are physical in nature. So it's really important when you're looking at eligibility to understand the different exclusionary conditions. So, for example, you could have somebody who has a comorbid condition, meaning that they have both a psychiatric illness as well as a developmental disability. And in fact, what we do know is there is a high prevalence rate for individuals to have both of those things. However, when psychiatric conditions are impairing cognitive functioning, now it's no longer a comorbid condition. What you're looking at is, as described, it's solely psychiatric. So it could be that perhaps test scores are impaired because they are in the throes of a psychotic presentation. They're so depressed that they really, attention is being impacted, things of that nature, or the medications are a factor. Those are all related to a psychiatric condition and not because they have their true cognitive estimate of their abilities are truly within the delayed range. When we talk about learning disabilities, yes, you would expect somebody with an intellectual disability to struggle academically. However, when we are thinking about learning disabilities, what we're really talking about is similar to federal IDA guidelines, in which both of them cannot occur together. So with regard to the definition of a learning disability, what we're talking about is that intellectual disability has been ruled out, and it's not as the result of why they're having the learning disability. It is mutually exclusive. And when we talk about physical in nature, that exclusion would be someone like who has MS, or perhaps they were in a motor vehicle accident, there's no cognitive impairment. However, physically they're impaired. And for example, they struggle with quadriplegia. So it's not the same thing, for example, of someone in that particular condition, that it's not similar to somebody with cerebral palsy, for example. Their motor skills are impaired because of damage to the spinal cord. And that's what we mean by some condition that's physical in nature. So the two questions really that come to play with regard to eligibility, it is a two-pronged test. Number one, the very first question is, does the individual have a qualifying condition for regional center eligibility under the Lanterman Act? And does the individual have a substantial disability in 3 or more areas of functioning? It's always needs to go back to as the result of a qualifying condition. So that's part of it is really important. You can't separate those two things. So for example, let me go back here. When we're talking about this two-pronged test, it's very enticing to look at substantial disability and look at all the different areas in which they're impaired. However, that impairment again has to go back to the very first question, but how is that impairment related to a qualifying condition? There's been greater complexity in addressing these two questions. Part of it is, as I mentioned, the 5th category. So that's always one that many people have struggled with. However, I would suggest that folks look at the Association for Regional Center Agency guidelines for determining 5th category eligibility for the regional centers. And that was approved by the ARCA Board of Directors on March 16, 2002, which is in conformance with the California Code of Regulations, Title 17, 54,000. And that should, I've got a typo there, that should be Welfare and Institution Code 4512 A and L. The other part of it that makes it very complex is changes in the DSM-5. So for example, as some of you may know, that there used to be for an autism spectrum disorder, there was PDD-NOS and Asperger's. There was 5 different areas. Now with the DSM-5, it all falls together under the same umbrella. But remember, if you have to do a redetermination, I want to remind you, it has to go back to when they were first found eligible. It's not what is it now, it was what was it then. So back in the day, for example, we used to find individuals with PDD-NOS eligible for the regional center. And then over time, that was determined it was no longer a qualifying condition. Well, now there is no such animal as PDD-NOS or Asperger's, right? It's all under the autism spectrum disorder. And I also want to point out in the DSM-5, it talks about severity specifiers, and there's 3 levels. However, that's not a substitute for Welfare and Institution Code 4512L, which is substantial disability. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about level of impairment as defined by the DSM-5, but eligibility is not based off of the DSM-5. It's based off of Lanterman. So there is no severity specifiers. The other change was an emphasis with regard to a change of how they do intellectual disability it used to be more that you would be looking at their cognitive scores, and that you would have to have 2 or, depending upon what edition, 2 or 3 areas of substantial disability. Now the emphasis is more on a qualitative definition, less on the cognitive scores, and you only need 1 area of adaptive deficit. However, again, I want to caution folks that according to DDS regulations, Lanterman 4512 A and L and Title 17 54,000, that always supersedes the DSM-5. So while the DSM-5 might say that they have an intellectual disability, it's not the same thing as the definition for Lanterman or Title 17. Other considerations in thinking about eligibility and what do we mean by substantial disability is the importance of what happens if there's conflicting information within different assessments, right? So at one point, the scores may be higher or lower. Same thing with the level of functioning. That's why we always we try to gather all the information. And it really shouldn't stop at time of intake. Gathering the information should be something that is done on an annual basis, especially when someone is still involved within the school system, because typically after the age of 23, many times those records get destroyed, so we lose our opportunity to get the information. So anytime somebody is found eligible for the regional center, or let's take it back to intake, I always ask, do we have all the records? Because we want to look at it over time to see what the big picture is, not just a snapshot in time. And that's really when you're looking at different assessments, that's the example I like to use. It is a snapshot in time. I want to see what it is overall. And then once they've been found eligible, like I said, it would be very helpful if service coordinators could continue to obtain a copy of their IEPs and their psychoeducational assessments. The triennials are that. It's usually updated every 3 years, and just put those into the file. Now, sometimes if you were to attend an IEP meeting, you might become aware that what their qualifying condition is for special education has changed. For example, it could be that perhaps when they were much younger, it was determined that they had an intellectual disability. However, as they had continued to be assessed, it became very clear that it's not an intellectual disability. Instead, I'll just say, perhaps it's a specific learning disability. The other could be true. It could be that early on, the only thing that they qualified for with special education was perhaps like a speech language impairment, or perhaps they did think that they had a specific learning disability. However, over time, it became much more clear that no, the deficit is such that it now meets the criteria for example, an intellectual disability, or perhaps it's become more evident that they have autism spectrum disorder. The opposite could be true with autism spectrum disorder as well, right? They could look like as if they have autism spectrum disorder and actually meet the criteria based off of the DSM. However, over time, it becomes clear that they no longer continue to meet that criteria, either by the diagnosis itself or perhaps it's substantial disability. So you can have individuals, for example, who have an intellectual disability, but they just don't happen to have 3 areas in which they're substantially handicapped. So that means that they would not qualify for ongoing, or if it's going through intake, they wouldn't qualify for regional center services. So just by example, I did a review on a case in which the individual was now after the age of 18, but she had qualified for regional center services. And when you looked at the records, certainly all of the cognitive scores would suggest that she had an intellectual disability, except for there was no evidence that she was substantially handicapped in 3 or more areas. Instead, this was an individual that, despite her cognitive scores being 70 and below, she was able to graduate from high school with a diploma. She went on to attain her education in junior college. She drove, she had her own apartment, she had a full-time job. So when we think about all the 7 areas of substantial disability, she just no longer met the criteria. And it was for that reason we went back and we said that was erroneous. We thought that she had a qualifying condition that was going to be substantially handicapped lifelong, and that just was inaccurate. So we want to look at you know, when we're looking at for eligibility or redetermination, we need to know what is it that we're looking at and try to understand, you know, not only the varying diagnoses, but the level of functioning. And so sometimes you'll see higher levels of functioning or lower levels of functioning depending upon the situation. So that brings us to the individual differences in and between informants. So sometimes the informant may not be fully aware of the individual's functioning, right? So that could be someone, for example, who's been removed from the home by CPS, for example, and now they're in a group home. Well, maybe that group home staff is not really well acquainted. They don't really know the individual that well. And so they may not be the best reporter, or based off of their experience, this is what they see. However, in a school setting, they may be either higher or lower functioning than what's being reported. So, you know, it always makes it difficult when you're looking at substantial disability and trying to determine, is there evidence of it, when you get someone that's either an over or an under report. Again, that goes back to, what do my records tell me over time? Because you should see a pattern. It shouldn't just be that they are cruising along just fine and all of a sudden they take a nosedive with regard to their adaptive scores, right? You should be able to see where they have continued to struggle over time and those deficits have become more apparent. The other part that you need to think about with regard to individual differences in and between informants is you can't overlook context. So you need to know under what situation are they reporting that this individual is higher functioning or lower functioning? Is this because of legal involvement? Is there some monetary gain like Social Security? They're seeking services. We've had those situations in which nobody else has ever reported that the individual was substantially had any substantial deficits until that came to they were seeking VMRC services. And then at that time, it was reported that that individual had very low levels of functioning. But when we looked at the records, again, that did not support that. And, you know, we even had a case, you know, that went through a state level hearing where that level of functioning, again, it changed. It was based off of who the parent was talking to as to whether or not what their level of functioning was. So again, when you have all the records, you can see the story as it evolves. The other thing that you need to take into consideration is cultural variables and family values and norms. So we can't just expect because someone isn't doing something, it's because they are unable to do it. Rather, is it culturally appropriate for them to do that or inappropriate, or what are just basically, as I've stated here, the family values and norms. And I've shared this example with many people. Those of you that don't know me, I'm actually half Japanese. So in my culture, in my family, there were many things that was just not expected for me to do. And so if someone were to have given my mother the questions and asked how I would do, like on the Vineland, for example, I would have scored very low. My deficits would have been very significant. It's not that I couldn't do them. I was not expected to. And the reason why I was not expected to, because of culture. So you have to think about those kinds of things. And so it's not just the scores, it's not just the numbers. You need to know the context. Other ways that we try to figure out truly what is their adaptive functioning is we're looking at testing. So it could be a multi-method, multi-operational best practice type. So again, this is multiple assessments in more than one session or in a variety of settings. And as I've stated, do not rely solely on interview to form a conclusion. We're looking at the whole story, which is all those records. And it gives better credibility with regard to understanding what their adaptive functioning if we get multiple informants from multiple settings who are all telling us the same thing. But with every tool, you also need to know that while they're standardized, they're norm, there are strengths and weaknesses. So let me explain, like an informant-based interview. We have the Vineland, we have the ABOS, we have the Street Survival Skills Questionnaire. There's scales of independent behavior revised. Those are some examples of some different measures that could be used. Each one of them have strengths and weaknesses to them. And again, numbers is one thing, application or how it plays out in real world is more important. Now, some people will say, well, if you use the Street Survival Skills Questionnaire, the norms are very outdated. It is true, but it is still a valid test, and it is the only one that's listed here in which it's not based on the informant. With the Street Survival Skills Questionnaire, they actually have to demonstrate that they either know or do not know the correct answer. So it adds a different level of understanding. There's other quantitative measures of achievement that one would look at when we gather the records, where the school might have, for example, they've administered the RAT5 or the Wyatt, any of those things. Those will tell us how they're doing academically. Then when we want to look at language, we're going to look at the quantitative measures of language acquisition, such as the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, one word receptive and expressive picture vocabulary test, one or a combination of those things. So that's going to tell us how someone is doing with regard to expressive communication as well as receptive. And also I wanted to call attention to each measure has inclusion and exclusion criteria as well as the strengths and the weaknesses, meaning that not all test instruments are intended to be used for every population. There are instances in which, say, if they're hearing impaired or visually impaired, or perhaps English is not their primary language, some of these different instruments that are listed here, which is not an exhaustive list, but certainly an example, some of them would not be appropriate to use. Another example would be somebody who has, for example, a psychiatric condition. Some of these instruments, you would not be using them for that population. The other thing that you have to take into consideration when you're thinking about substantial disability is differential diagnosis, meaning is it related to some other condition that better explains what it is that we're looking at. So when they're doing comprehensive evaluation for autism or intellectual disability, part of that assessment that the vendors would be looking for is it truly an intellectual disability, or is it truly autism spectrum disorder, or are we looking at some other condition that better explains the presentation? The DSM-5, it stresses to take into consideration age of onset, cultural factors, family history, any genetic indicators, and as I mentioned before, possible comorbidity before making a final diagnosis of either autism or intellectual disability. So again, there's a lot of factors that need to be considered, and it's not intended, the DSM-5 is not intended to be like a recipe, where here's the different elements and here's what makes a salad, or something that you're cooking or preparing. You need to look at all the information in coming to a conclusion. And when to turn the diagnosis. As when you're seeing a deficit and for example, it's related to ADHD. But sometimes, like I said, that's clear. Other times, perhaps not. And when we know, for example, like with autism spectrum disorder, there is a high prevalence rate of individuals who will have a co-occurring disorder. And one of those particular disorders, for example, would be ADHD. So sometimes it's hard to parcel it out. Other possible differential diagnosis are those that are listed here. It could be some other neurodevelopmental disorder, thought disorder, mood disorder, disruptive impulse control or conduct disorder. Could be personality disorder, processing disorder. That's kind of when you're looking at it could be related more to specific learning disability as opposed to intellectual disability. You can't also forget that it could be as the result of alcohol and substance use. Any of these conditions can potentially impact level of daily functioning. So with turning specifically to substantial disability and by age, the first one we want to look at are children ages 3 to 12. And so it's not until they're 6 years of age do you get this sixth category. Otherwise, before that time, from 3 to 5, it's only the first 5 areas that can be considered. And it's, again, not until they're 6 that you're looking at looking at things like, are they able to pick up their toys and put them away, put their clothes in the laundry basket, those types of things. But we're not going to really expect that until they're about 6 years of age. Do children do that at a younger age? Yes, they can, but it's really not an expectation until they're, again, 6 years of age and older. Then when we look at adolescents, ages 13 to all the way through adulthood, now this is where we have our 7 areas. But it's not until the economic self-sufficiency doesn't come in until age 16. And again, it's not that we expect them to be able to go out and get a job and to be fully independent, but they should be doing either things around the home that where they're making money, they're earning money in some way, or perhaps they're involved in vocational training in high school. And so we would want to know, if so, how are they doing? How much support are they needing in school in order to be successful? So let's look at just self-care. Again, everything is by age, but self-care for all ages. What we're looking at is personal hygiene, grooming, and feeding. So it takes into consideration whether the child currently demonstrates the ability or has the innate ability to learn the information. It's not whether they require prompting or reminders. So again, can they do it? That's really what it comes down to. Now, if they need hand over hand or a lot of support, now you're looking at someone who has a substantial disability. Are they not doing it because they're just really not interested? They don't really care. That's a whole different story, right? Or they're just resistant. That's different than whether or not they actually have the ability. Again, you're wanting to take into consideration what would be the age expectations for that child. The cultural or family norms. Are they not doing it because they're being defiant, or perhaps there's a psychiatric illness? So what I mean by psychiatric illness, so as someone gets older and perhaps they're struggling with depression, for example, they may not want to get up and they may be spending a lot of time in their room and they're not showering for days, or, not bathing, showering, bathing, eating, all those kinds of things. Or perhaps medication effects might be why the person is not able to take care of themselves. So all of those things have to be considered. Is it truly a deficit as the result of a qualifying condition, or is it something else that explains why those deficits are there? So if we look at preschoolers, we want to drill down to what would we expect from somebody who's 3 to 5 years of age? Well, we would want to know, can they chew and swallow proficiently? Maybe they can't. That's where cerebral palsy comes into play. Perhaps they have deficits with motor control that makes it very difficult. Are they able to drink from a cup independently with little spillage? Do they use utensils? Do they alert their parent that they've soiled, or they've soiled their diaper, or they need to use the restroom? Remove their own clothes. At that age, it doesn't have to be that they can do it independently. It could be more that are they able to assist? Do they raise their arms up, put their foot out for their shoes to be put on? Again, that's making those helpful movements during personal care activities. Other things that you would want to look at for elementary school age is now they should be able to do more things than what a 3 to 5 year old would be able to do, and they should be able to do it more independently now. So like you can see, washes face independently or eats independently with neatness. By that age, you would expect someone to be toilet trained, that they can regulate their own water for bathing, that type of a thing. Self-care suggestions when you're interviewing. Now, when we talk about interviewing, we tend to think about intake, but again, I want to emphasize, these are questions that should be asked also when you're preparing, when you meet with the family and you're looking at your development of the IPP. So first thing you want to do is when you're interacting with the child, when you first see them, you would lay visual eyes on them and determine, how do they look to you with regards to hygiene and general appearance? When asked in general about self-care, ask the parent or whoever the provider is, do they have any concerns about their self-care? Are they able to perform those self-care skills independently? And then again, are the tasks not completed because of inability to understand the steps, or is it a compliance issue? And again, I just put in here, when we're looking at cerebral palsy, some specific considerations, as I mentioned, if there's any oral or motor limitations with regard to eating, chewing, or swallowing. The other part of it you would be looking at with regard to cerebral palsy is gross and fine motor issues. Related to that is, does that make it really difficult for them to button their clothes or, zip their clothes up, things of that nature, to use utensils? Those are the kinds of things you would be focusing on and looking at self-care when the individual has cerebral palsy. Self-care, additional considerations and questions. This is for someone who's 13 years and up. Now, can they swallow pills? I mean, face it, there are some adults that have a difficult time with swallowing pills. So you're never really going to focus typically on just one of these items as to whether or not they meet the qualifying condition. You're going to be looking at it overall. Now, certainly, there is an exception. If the deficit is very extreme, and it'd have to be something more than just swallowing pills, but if the deficit is really extreme and it really impairs their ability to function independently, you can count just one of the areas, but the idea is to be looking at it more globally. So, you would be looking at, can they bathe or shower independently, using hygiene type products, things of that nature. Here we go. First pop quiz. Let me see if I can close my window here. Yeah, I can. Okay. So sorry, guys, this is a very long question, so bear with me. As part of the IPP update, parent shares that Jesus, who's 9 years of age, is a delightful son. He was found eligible for regional center services on the basis of moderate intellectual disability after exiting from early start services. Given test findings, he was found permanently eligible for ongoing regional center services with substantial deficits in self-care, learning, and communication. Since that time, Mom reports that Jesus has really blossomed since he started school. He is now mainstreamed in the classroom with resource services, and since his last IPP, Jesus is now able to completely dress himself and fasten small buttons in the correct buttonholes. He can connect and zip zippers that are not fastened at the bottom. He's further able to select appropriate attire for school that is weather appropriate. And although he still needs help adjusting the water temperature, he is able to wash both his body and hair without any assistance. While in the community, he locates and uses the appropriate restroom of his gender. Mom further added that although her son is able to use the microwave, he does continue to require supervision because he accidentally burned some microwave popcorn once. Otherwise, while eating meals, he uses utensils appropriately and refrains from talking with food in his mouth. Jesus can also talk with others without interrupting, and according to Mom, he's a polite boy and is never rude to others. This is a two-part question. One, is there sufficient evidence of substantial disability and self-care? And two, where would this information be documented on the IPP? So you can see you have four possible options here. A, no, based on his age, his healthcare skills are adequate and therefore the information does not need to be included on the IPP. B, yes, at 9 years of age, he should be able to adjust the water for bathing independently, and he could have caused a fire when he burnt the popcorn. The best place to document this information would be in the independent living skills section, as it supports evidence of substantial disability due to intellectual disability. Or is it C? While there's no evidence of significant self-care skills, the updated information should still be included in the independent living section. Or D, no, there's no evidence of substantial disability in the area of self-care, and this updated information should be documented in the personal care section. So you'll have 30 seconds to think about this. Is it A, B, C, or D?
So we're starting to get some answers. I'll give you 5 more seconds to answer. I think some of them are still thinking. There's very few who have responded so far. Okay, I'm about, oh, no, there's still some answers. Okay, alrighty, so I'm about to close this in 3, 2, 1, and polling. All right, now we're going to share the results.
So it looks like it's kind of split between B and D. So with B, there was 38% thought that that was the best answer, and that independent living section would be where it would be supported. 36% thought no, there's no evidence of substantial disability in the area of self-care, but it should still be updated information in personal self-care section. Drum roll, it is answer D. Jesus' self-care is age appropriate. So A is only partially correct in that while his self-care is no longer substantially handicapped, Remember, both strengths and weaknesses should be reflected in the IPP. B is not the best answer, despite his need for assistance in adjusting the water for bathing or needed supervision when using the microwave. Remember, the overall focus of self-care is personal hygiene, grooming, and feeding. C is only partially correct. Again, while there's no evidence of substantial disability in self-care, the noted strengths and weaknesses in independent living skills is not the most appropriate section for documentation of personal self-care. And then D, why is that the right answer or the best answer? Is because, again, there is no substantial evidence of deficits in self-care, and the best section to document this would be in personal care, hygiene, bathing, and dressing. And of course, as I mentioned, this would include any strengths or limitations that are directly related to those particular areas. So now let's turn to receptive and expressive language. The definition for all ages is that the individual has significant limitations in both comprehension and expression of verbal and nonverbal communication, meaning that there must be impairment in both areas in order for it to be a substantial disability. So simply because someone has a speech impairment, that would be an expressive language. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is a receptive deficit. And again, it has to be as the result of a qualifying condition, which would include, is it is because they have epilepsy, cerebral palsy, autism, intellectual disability, or a fifth category condition. So just a speech impairment in and of itself is not, doesn't mean that you would check the box on, say, eligibility review, that they have that deficit. It has to be as the direct result of the qualifying condition. So I have listed here some standard measures that you might see in some of the psychoeducational evaluations. Sometimes you'll see them where one of our vendors will have administered. And as I said, the deficit must be as the direct result of a qualifying condition and not an exclusionary condition, such as like a hearing impairment, a speech language impairment, some other genetic condition that might impact language. Considerations is significant difficulty understanding a simple conversation, needing information to be rephrased or simplified, significant difficulty following directions. Again, it's not due to general non-compliance though. And significant difficulty understanding and interpreting nonverbal communication, such as gestures and facial expressions, for example. Expressive language considerations, again, for all ages, you're looking at, as I mentioned, significant difficulty communicating information, participating in a basic conversation, which would talk about, you know, are they fixated? Like, I can talk about certain things, but only on areas of my own personal interest. Or do they not follow rules for conversation and storytelling, that back and forth kind of exchange? Is you're looking for atypical speech patterns that significantly impair the individual's ability to communicate, like the use of jargon, idiosyncratic language, echolalia. Typical language milestones are also important to take into consideration. It's, as I have noted here, language is complex and it's a dynamic system of conventional symbols that's used in various modes for thought, comprehension, and communication, and it evolves over time and circumstance, right? We talk one way when we're with our peers, you know, children will, versus when they're in a classroom setting or talking with their parents. As they get older, their communication skills should become more complex over time. Receptive language milestones include the ability to identify categories, make inferences, understand analogies, to understand time concepts and qualitative concepts. Expressive language milestones over time as it evolves. In general, they should be intelligible to the unfamiliar listener. They have the ability to use regular past tense verbs, to compare similarities, repeat sentences upon request, to define words, rhyme words, tell a story in sequence. If they make a grammatical error, they're aware of it and they'll self-correct. Those are the kinds of things that you would be looking for. When looking at suggested considerations and interview questions for someone 3 to 12 years of age, you're going to be, as I mentioned, you're going to be keying into, can the child usually follow a simple conversation? Does the information or request frequently need to be rephrased or simplified? Can they follow directions? If they can follow directions, how many directions can they follow at a time? Are we talking about just a single step direction, or can they do 3 or more? Again, that's going to be based on age. And does the child have any noticeable difficulty in making sense of nonverbal communication, such as if you use a gesture or a facial expression, do they pick up on those cues? Those are the types of things that you would be asking the parent, or even noticing during your interview or your meeting with them. Receptive language, suggested considerations. Does the individual understand general information? What is the response time? So is there a prolonged response before they answer the question? You'd be thinking about, is this a deficit, and is this a deficit because of a cognitive impairment, or is this a deficit because of like a speech language impairment, and perhaps they have like what's referred to as an auditory processing disorder. We already talked about following directions, how many steps, that type of a thing. Does the individual have significant difficulty understanding and interpreting nonverbal communication? Does the individual monitor the listener's reactions and comprehension? Do they have the comprehension of the statements and information? So those are just some examples. I won't go necessarily through all of these in every one of the slides, because at the end of this, either later today or by the end of the week, I'll make sure that individuals who've attended get a copy of the guidelines where many of these things are listed here. Expressive language, suggested considerations. How does the child communicate needs and wants? Can they have that back and forth conversation? As I mentioned, do they tend only to speak about their own interests? Those kinds of things you're looking for, as many of you probably have picked up on. We're going to tend to see those types of things either in the areas of cerebral palsy, autism, or a cognitive impairment. When we think about cerebral palsy, we're going to think about, is there some oral motor deficit that makes it very difficult for them to communicate? When we think about autism, that's that to and fro, the pragmatic part of it. Or yeah, they have no difficulty at all in expressive language, but you know, to be able to talk about things, but it's only their own things that are of interest. Or you have somebody that, for example, might have an intellectual disability who might also struggle with expressive and receptive language. When we're looking at ages 13 on up, we're going to be, again, are they able to engage in reciprocal conversation, ask appropriate questions? Looking at the IEP, do they participate in group conversation with friends? You'll see that noted in the IEP or even in a psychoeducational assessment. Especially they typically do observations in one or more settings, the school psychologist will, and they'll make reference as to how they're doing in class when they were observed or out on the playground. And are they interacting with their peers, and is it age appropriate? And then the other part of it is, does the individual have any odd or unusual ways of speaking? Again, we would be kind of focusing there on autism. There is an exception to the language criteria. As I mentioned, it is and was intended to be with Lanterman that expressive and receptive. However, it's also been noted that with an individual with autism spectrum disorder, following a confirmed California best practice assessment, if there's supportive evidence of a significant pragmatic deficit, then and only then is this sufficient to meet the criteria for substantial disability in communication. So by pragmatic skills, that involves the use of language to communicate as opposed to the content or form of the language. Children with autism spectrum disorder, they may have above average skills in language forms such as sound production and grammar or content, yet they struggle with the pragmatic skills such as turn taking, offering greetings, and maintaining or changing a conversational topic. Those are deficits that is specific to that particular disorder, and you do not have to have both the expressive and the receptive in that circumstance. Simply, if there is evidence that they meet the criteria for autism, and usually the school, when they're doing a speech evaluation, a speech language evaluation, one of their test measures, or even on the IEP, you might see that the goal is to work on their pragmatic skills. And if they are substantially handicapped in that area, then that will satisfy that criteria. And then I had put on here, you would also consider non-communicative speech, such as the echolalia or the babbling. Again, they may understand what you're saying to them. They just don't have the language, though, to be able to communicate. So again, here we are. You guessed it, pop quiz. Sorry, these are very long scenarios. Ryan was initially referred to VMRC at 19 months of age. However, the case was closed at the I&I level. At 33 months of age, he was once more referred and was subsequently found eligible for early start services due to deficits as measured by the Mullen and the HELP in the areas of communication, motor, and cognitive skills. At that time, a review of available records indicate that temper tantrums were common with significant delay in language acquisition based on parent and intake coordinator interaction. Although obtained scores suggested delay in motor skills, the IFSP indicated that he was able to remove food and candy wrappers independently, unzip zippers, was able to spoon feed himself without excessive spillage, to undress himself, and to ambulate independently. Moreover, it was reported that Ryan enjoys pretend play, social interaction, imitates grown-up activities, and frequently recites nursery rhymes. Results of the MCHAT were negative at 33 and 36 months of age. At 35 months of age, he underwent a speech language assessment, and results would continue to support evidence of expressive language skills as measured by the expressive one-word picture vocabulary test, in which he obtained a standard score of 84, with 100 being average, and receptive one-word picture vocabulary test findings of a standard score of 56, which would be in the very significantly delayed area. In addition, results of the Rossetti infant-toddler language scales further indicated significant deficit in pragmatic skills with an age equivalent of 18 to 20 months. He was 35 months of age at that time. The speech therapist expressed concerns of possible ASD given rigidity, inconsistent eye contact, and failure to respond to his name. Lastly, a VMRC vendor contacted the service coordinator to report concerns of suspected ASD, which was similar to that reported by the speech language examiner, as well as the occurrence of frequent meltdowns, repetitive and scripted speech, and other rigid behavior that impacted learning. Based on available information, do the results support sufficient evidence of substantial disability in communication? You have three choices: A, no, results of the speech language assessment suggest significant deficit in expressive language only as measured by the receptive one-word picture vocabulary. B, yes, because his receptive, which is standard score 56, and pragmatic skills of 18 to 21 months are significantly impaired. Or C, maybe, maybe not. So you have 30 seconds.
We're starting to receive responses, so that's good. Five more seconds. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end the polling.
And what do we have? We have the majority of people thought that B was the best answer. Let's look to see what we have. Actually, the best answer, this, as I mentioned here, this was a tricky one. The best answer is C, maybe, maybe not. A is incorrect because remember, both expressive and receptive must be evident. In this instance, there is only evidence of receptive. So that's why that's not the best answer. B is incorrect. While there's substantial evidence of the receptive and the pragmatic, the exception rule would only apply if autism had been diagnosed. If ASD is not relevant, then the deficits may suggest a specific learning impairment, which is an exclusionary condition as it relates to regional center eligibility. So in this scenario, C is the best answer, meaning maybe or maybe not that it would apply. In that if we look at the big picture, it is possible if Ryan were to undergo a California best practice autism assessment, he could meet the DSM. It's 5 criteria for autism, in which case the collateral information and prior test findings would indicate that the communication criteria for substantial disability had been met. When thinking about whether autism spectrum assessment is warranted, it's really about all the little pieces. For example, if we were to think, well, but if the MCHAT, it was negative both times, okay? That's 2 pieces of the puzzle. But it's also important to remember that the MCHAT findings are based on parent report, which can be inaccurate. Sometimes it's, as we know, it's an over-report or an under-report. There was also evidence of a substantial deficit in both receptive language and the pragmatic skills. And those can both be red flags for autism. But again, remember, he's not undergone the best practice evaluation. The other parts of the puzzle were a review of the speech language examiner who talked about rigidity, inconsistent eye contact, and poor response to name, as well as the VMRC vendor, who also shared concerns of suspected autism. And again, if evident, then it would meet the criteria for disability, for substantial disability. In this case, it would be not only communication, but also learning and self-direction. So with respect to Ryan, an autism assessment is warranted. And in this instance, either the VMRC staff psychologist or the autism, the ASD coordinator should be consulted. Or if the case was going through either intake or a redetermination process, either the intake coordinator or service coordinator should be contacted directly to discuss a referral for an autism assessment. Lastly, as stated in response B, if ASD is ruled out while the deficit in communication is relevant, It is not the result of a qualifying condition. Don't forget, there's the two-prong test, right? You have to have the qualifying condition and be substantially handicapped. Does that make sense? And does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, not hearing any. Let's go to the next area, which is learning. The definition for all ages is the individuals must be substantially impaired in the ability to acquire and apply knowledge or skills to a new situation despite intervention. Things that we would look for with regard to what can we find when we look at records, we're going to be looking at their cognitive scores. For intellectual disability, we're going to be looking at standard scores, generally 70 and below. For fifth category, generally 75 and below. Deficits in academic achievement levels. That alone is not enough in order to qualify for learning, because the deficit in academic achievement level could be because it's a learning disability. So be careful about that one. But if you have somebody who has an intellectual disability, for example, or a condition similar to, both cognitive and academic achievement would both be similarly impaired. You'd be looking at impaired retention, such as short or long-term memory, or inadequate reasoning, the ability to grasp concepts, to perceive cause and effect relationships, to generalize information. Those are the types of things that you would be looking for, either whether it's something that perhaps the parent has shared with you or something that you would see within psychoeducational evaluations or the IEP. Assessment considerations. I have in here, although individuals may display impairment in learning, I already mentioned this. Remember, it's not necessarily because it's a qualifying condition. It could be an exclusionary condition. It could be because I mentioned specific learning disability. I also want to mention it could be as the result of a psychiatric condition or other form of disability that is impacting their learning. So for example, say they have ADHD, but they're not properly medicated. Well, they're not going to be able to attend, meaning they're not going to be able to pay attention. And so their test scores could go down. Same thing for somebody with bipolar disorder, somebody who's experiencing different, like psychosis or depression. All of those things can affect test scores and artificially bring those down. But it doesn't mean that they have an intellectual disability. They're just simply impacted by their psychiatric condition. There could be other forms of disability that result in those lower test scores. Say that they have some motor condition that affects their response rate. So some of the cognitive scores, for example, they're timed. And say they have a visual motor impairment, or again, like a motor deficit, they're going to do much poorly on those timed tests, not because they don't understand what it is to do, like manipulating the blocks. It's just harder for them to do that. It's necessary to differentiate an individual with an inability to learn, regardless of the quality intervention. To learn regardless of quality intervention from that of an individual that has the ability to give, given the appropriate resources and time. So again, if we want to look at ADHD, sometimes those kids are very overwhelmed by the stimulus. So an intervention would be that they cover their page and they can only see one question at a time. I can't, sorry about that. So you have to think about those kinds of things as to whether or not that's artificially bringing down those test scores, and it really has nothing to do with cognitive impairment. I mentioned this earlier on, that it's important to understand the distinction and relevance between intellectual disability and a specific learning disability. That's a very difficult one for people to grasp, because they say, well, but they're really impaired. They can't read, they're not following directions, they can't remember things that I'm saying to them, you know, they're not able to function, real world kind of a thing. However, when we look at their cognitive skills scores, there's not that deficit. And first, in order for someone to meet the definition of a specific learning disability, it's defined again, like I had mentioned, the IDEA, which is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that will tell you whether or not cognitive functioning, intellectual deficit has been ruled out. As I mentioned previously, they are mutually exclusive. Along with the specific learning disability, as I mentioned, both psychiatric and physical also are exclusionary conditions. And so any deficits that we see in adaptive functioning as a result of those things are not the same thing as a qualifying condition. So when we are interacting with the parent or the consumer, reading through academic records, things of that nature, for ages 3 and 5, here's some examples of things that you would want to know. Can they point and identify body parts? Do they know, are they beginning to, know their colors, different shapes? Again, kind of depending upon their age. You're not going to expect a 3-year-old to maybe recognize all the letters in the alphabet, things of that nature. So that would be someone closer to the 5-year age range. Additional things that you would want to consider, what was it like to teach the child a task? How much did you have to break that down in order for them to grasp it? If told that the stove is hot, would the child not touch it? If they are taught to clean up at daycare or a school setting, do they follow that same rule at home? And this is really important to follow up with, if not, why not? For someone 6 to 12 years of age, as we would expect, those demands are going to become greater. So we're also going to want to know, is the child receiving special education? What's the estimation of their reading level, math level? Can they tell time on an analog clock, at least by the hour? Are they able to recall what they did last weekend or what they did for their last birthday? I do want to bring attention to one of the bullet points here. It says, can the child identify coins and understand their value? The reason why I want to draw attention to this is I want to underscore, when it comes to money or different things, that examples that I have listed here, a deficit can only be noted in one area. You cannot double count this. So can the child identify coins and understand their value? That's learning. Do they have the ability to make a purchase and to know that if they're receiving the correct change, that's capacity for independent living. So you have to think about where is it that best reflects the deficit? Should you say, no, this is a deficit that's clearly an example of a learning deficit, or if they're older, where the independent living part of it comes into play, is that better captured in independent living? But again, you cannot double count. And so I see that sometimes when I'm going through reviews and it's listed in multiple places, and that's really inappropriate. You're thinking about, what is the question, what is the function, what makes sense. Other learning, other areas that you would want to consider for ages 6 to 12 with regard to learning. Again, you would ask, what's the last task the child recently learned how to do? What was it like teaching them that? Thinking about present situations that should be appropriate for their age. Like, by this age, they should be able to choose appropriate clothing according to the weather. And again, they should know by then that you don't touch something that's hot, like a stove, those types of things. Those should be pretty typical for someone that age. When we're talking about someone who's 13 and up, again, we're looking at their reading level, but be careful. As I said, this is not about a specific learning disability. What you're kind of cueing in here is, can they tell you what it means? What was it that they read? Those kinds of things. Can they read news articles, understand it? Here's again, something to do with money. If you bought milk at a store and it cost $2.25, how much change would you get if you paid with a $5 bill? Again, that's learning that transaction, that's applying math skills. Do they understand time? Now it's not just by the hour, but it's a quarter after the hour, for example. Do they understand time differences? Like if something were going to happen in 2 weeks' time versus 3 weeks' time. If they're an adult, how much money do they earn on an hourly basis, and how much do you earn each month? That's what that's cueing into. Or to ask them questions of, why do you wash your clothes? Tell me why you have to turn off the lights. That's talking about that cause and effect type of examples of what that's cueing into. Okay, our next pop quiz. When Jack was 5 years old, he was diagnosed with ADHD, predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation. Currently, Jack is 23 years of age, and his mother is requesting an intake assessment. A review of available psychoeducational assessments and IEPs that mom has kept over the years indicates that Jack was served as a student with an intellectual disability and other health impairment, which was attributed to ADHD throughout his academic career. Although his doctor and school personnel tried to encourage medication compliance, Jack's mother discontinued the prescribed medication after several years, complaining that Jack was unable to sleep well at night, and adding that it really didn't matter because he was never able to learn to read like the other students. A review of available records would support mother's impression with respect to cognitive delay, as measured by repeated test scores falling within the range of 68 to 72. During the intake meeting, mom shared that due to ongoing acting out behavior, Jack was unable to be served within the mainstream classroom. She reported that on more than one occasion, he was suspended from school due to fighting and refusing to complete classroom assignments. School records further indicate that Jack had a difficult time following three-part directions, and his mother confirms that this continues to be an ongoing problem. Academic records indicate that Jack required frequent repetition and simplification, yet never demonstrated mastery in math or reading beyond the 6th grade level of abilities. Although he is able to identify coin and paper currency, when making a purchase, mom reports that he usually gives the cashier whatever money he has in his pocket without waiting for change. Mom shared her feelings of frustration that Jack has been unable to keep a job because he can't sit still or stay focused. Based on the available information, is there evidence of substantial disability in learning? So you have three choices. A, yes, based on deficits in memory and ability to learn despite simplification and repetition, and cognitive scores which are within the ID range. Moreover, given poor response to ADHD medication, it clearly proves that the diagnosis of ADHD was inaccurate. B, no, I think that his untreated ADHD has been a significant factor with respect to his inability to focus and learn. Also, everyone knows that kids with ADHD often get in trouble for acting out behavior and failing to complete their classroom assignments. Or C, yes, I think that despite example of untreated ADHD, his test findings and demonstrated overall lack of understanding despite intervention such as medication, repetition, simplification, and lack of retention suggests evidence of a co-occurring disorder, meaning both intellectual disability and ADHD. And you have 30 seconds.
And Barbara, when you're done with this poll, we do have a question from Melissa.
Okay, 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm gonna end the polling. And
So what do
here's
we
the
have?
result.
85% feel that C is the best answer. What do we have? You're absolutely correct. C is the best response. A is only partially correct in that there is evidence of substantial disability in learning as the result of ID. However, there was also evidence of ADHD. B is not the best response simply because while there's evidence of ADHD, which it can impact learning and can result in disruptive behavior, his overall deficits are beyond that is solely attributed to ADHD. So that is why C is the best answer. There is evidence of both. So despite example of inconsistent ADHD treatment, his repeated test findings and demonstrated overall lack of understanding, here's the part that's key, despite intervention, suggests evidence of a co-occurring disorder. Remember, risk of co-occurring psychiatric condition is higher within the DD population in comparison to neurotypical peers. So you guys did a great job. Give yourself a pat on the back for that one. Okay, so what's the question?
The question is, if you only consider money to one category of either learning or economic self-sufficiency, would you only consider choosing appropriate clothes for weather in either self-care or learning? Many skills fall in more than one category.
So what's this for the clothing? What was that one again?
She's saying if you consider money of either learning or economic self-sufficiency, would you only consider choosing appropriate, choosing the appropriate clothes for weather? Would that be either in self-care or learning?
It depends on what is the deficit. Why is there a deficit there? So remember, self-care is, having to do with feeding, hygiene, and grooming, right? And also it could be because perhaps they can't do that because of some motor deficit. So if they have a motor deficit, you could put it into self-care as to why they have. So that would be the exception of why it could possibly be self-care. Otherwise, that's not a deficit that you would normally put into self-care. And then learning, it's because they don't really understand it's cold outside or it's hot outside or it's raining, those types of things. They don't make that total connection. And that's why it would go into learning. So it really depends on what is the deficit, what's the source of the deficit. Does that make sense for whoever answered that question, or did they have a follow-up?
She has a follow-up. It's Melissa Oldine. She says, okay, so we put the deficit in the area that is best described by the qualifying condition. Correct. Okay.
The qualifying condition, or what's causing that deficit. Maybe that's the better way to say it. What's causing the deficit? Is it motor, or is it, well, I guess the way that Melissa said it, it is correct. It would be because of learning, because of a cognitive impairment, right? So it really is tied into that of, again, what is the source of the deficit? Not just that the deficit exists. Same thing if we think about learning, right? So you might have someone who has poor math or reading or skills, that type of a thing. Well, they could have that deficit, but it has nothing to do with the qualifying condition, right? Or it could be if they have a cognitive impairment. So I hope that makes sense.
She says she's got it, and thank you.
You're welcome. So let's go to our next area, mobility. So what this means is, this is all ages. It's a significant limitation with independent ambulation. I put this in there bold and underlined because it came to my attention when I first started working for the regional center that people didn't really understand mobility. They were thinking about mobility in a more abstract way. This, what you see on the screen, is what we mean by, do they have, and you'll have heard me say over and over throughout this presentation, I'll use typically the term significant or substantial. The reason for that is the definition. So somebody, if they have a mild deficit, that is not significant. In order for you to qualify in any of those different categories, we're talking about significant or substantial deficits. So when we talk about mobility, we're looking at, are they reliant on crutches, walker, wheelchair? Are there gait abnormalities that are causing significant coordination with mobility? Are they unable to walk long distances due to fatigue from a significant effort in ambulating? Again, it has to be something physical that's causing it, and that physical condition has to be the result of a qualifying condition. It can't be because they're, for example, that they're overweight, or I don't know, I can't think of anything else off the top of my head of why they wouldn't be able to ambulate. So say it's because they, you know, back to the example I gave initially about somebody who was in a vehicle accident and they have spinal cord injury, and now they are quadriplegic and they're not able to ambulate any longer. Well, they might not be able to ambulate, but it's not a qualifying condition unless they also had a traumatic brain injury. And now their cognitive impairment is evident, right? So it can't be because of an exclusionary condition, like, you know, going back to the spinal cord injury. That's something that is solely physical in nature. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about mobility, and doesn't matter of what age that we're talking about. Suggested interview questions, again, are there assistive devices that they're relying on? How far and how long? Are they able to ambulate without devices, or, you know, how difficult is it for them to do that? So before we get to our wonderful quiz again, I do want to emphasize before, like I said, mobility was taken more abstractly in the past, and it was inaccurate. So for example, when I first started at the regional center, some people considered an impairment in mobility if they were unable to use public transportation or they couldn't drive. So we spent a lot of time, we as in the ARCA psychologists, to be very clear about what we meant about mobility. And the other backstory with regard to substantial disability is, before we put this together, these guidelines, and before they were adopted by DDS, is that what we found was eligibility for regional center services was really based on zip code, because it appeared that many different regional centers were defining these in various ways, and that we were not on the same page. And so it became obvious that, no, we all need to be talking about the same thing. We can't say, I'll stick with the example of mobility. Well, I think that they have a deficit in mobility because they can't use public transportation, yet they move to Alta Regional Center and they're like, that's not what mobility means. Mobility is are they able to ambulate without assistance? So we would say they were eligible perhaps because of in that particular area, where Alta Regional Center would say, no, there's no deficit there. And so that's why it became really crucial for everyone to get together throughout all the regional centers to let's look at the Lanterman, let's look at Title 17, make sure that we're all on the same page so that no matter what regional center someone were to go to, we're all talking about the same thing. We're all using the same language. It also became important in coming up with the guidelines is because it should be documented, as I mentioned in the intake, it should be documented on the IPP, but it should also, an eligibility review team, they should all be talking about it the same way. If there's an appeal, everyone should be on the same page. And then also, we would want vendors to have this training because we would like them to be able to reflect some of these areas when they're writing reports. So they're not just reporting a test score, for example, they're giving us real world examples. And those examples can not only help us with regard to determining eligibility or ineligibility for regional center services, but hopefully it can also help us guide us when we're talking about the development of their IPP, of what services are we going to be providing and how is it related to their developmental disability. So you can see how having a mutual understanding of all of these areas, what their level of importance is, so that we're all talking about the same thing as opposed to apples and oranges. So, quiz. At time of the regional center intake, Mary, age 18, reported that after repeated attempts, she eventually obtained a driver's license. Her mother relayed concerns given multiple traffic accidents and 2 recent fender benders. Mother went on to report that before that, Mary relied on public transport, but again was concerned with her inability to understand the bus schedule. By way of history, Mary was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. Over an extensive period, she received physical therapy and continues to rely on a walker for everyday ambulation. Even with adaptive assistance, Mary is unable to walk long distances due to fatigue from a significant effort involved in ambulation. Stairs and uneven terrain continue to prove difficult for Mary to navigate. Academic and medical records substantiate Mary's physical challenges. What examples provided during the intake interview best establish evidence of substantial mobility disability? You have 4 choices. A, the multiple traffic tickets, 2 recent fender benders, and ability to rely on public transportation. Is it the medical evidence of CP says it all? Or C, does diagnosis of CP resulting in fatigue while walking long distances, relying on the walker, and continued difficulty in navigating stairs or uneven terrain? Is that the best answer, or none of the above? You have 30 seconds.
We're getting a lot of responses here, so that's good. Okay, you got 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Ending the poll now.
Let's see what we have. So we said C was the best answer, which is the diagnosis of CP resulting in fatigue while walking long distances, etc. So let's look. And yes, yay, C is the right answer. So remember, A, that was actually diverting your attention when you talk about the multiple traffic tickets, that type of thing, fender bender, because remember I said it's not about their ability to use the bus or to drive a car. That has nothing to do with mobility. It might have something to do with capacity for independent living or learning, but it's not mobility. And B, the diagnosis of CP, as we know, it's a two-pronged test, right? You have to have the qualifying condition and substantial disability. So the impaired mobility is only one of 3 areas that would be related to CP. And for obvious reasons, C is the best response. And what I have here is obviously that cerebral palsy is a group of permanent movement disorders that appear in early childhood. Signs and symptoms vary among people and over time. And the reason why I put that in there and I underlined that is because that, again, it can change and it is person specific. So simply because somebody has cerebral palsy doesn't mean that they automatically meet the criteria for as having a qualifying condition. The same thing with any of the qualifying conditions. Simply because you have intellectual disability doesn't mean that you're going to have 3 areas of substantial deficit. Or if you have epilepsy, it might not be significant. You could have mild epilepsy, or it could be controlled with medication. So therefore, yes, you have epilepsy, but it's not substantial. So that's the reason why I have that in there. Other symptoms of cerebral palsy include poor coordination, stiff muscles, weak muscles, tremors. There can be problems with sensation, vision, hearing, swallowing, and speaking. Thinking about the vision and the swallowing, speaking, think about those kinds of things when it comes to other areas of substantial disability. It might also impact why she is having so many multiple traffic tickets. It could either be motor control or it could be visual for her. In any event, in this scenario, the diagnosis of CP has resulted in the need for physical therapy, and all the other examples, the fatigue and the reliance on the walker, all of those things speak to the deficit with regard to mobility. And it's for that reason why that really captures the whole essence of that entire scenario. Now we're going to move on to self-direction. So this definition is for all ages, and we are talking about 3 particular areas. We're talking about emotional development, again, not a level resulting in a psychiatric condition, and we're also talking about interpersonal relationships, personal judgment, decision-making, choices. When you think about interpersonal relationships, again, we're not talking about a psychiatric condition like somebody who has a personality disorder, right? It's having to do with some of these examples here. So like the emotional development, they routinely have significant difficulty coping with fears, anxieties, or frustrations. Well, you could say that they have like some kind of an anxiety disorder. That's not really what we're talking about. They can have it, but it doesn't rise to that level of clinical significance. Severe maladaptive behavior, such as self-injurious behavior. You're going to see that self-injurious behavior as cognitive functioning is in the much lower ranges. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at different reasons for why they're engaging in that self-injurious behavior. It could be, there are some individuals, for example, with autism who will engage in the self-injurious behavior. And it's not self-injurious behavior like we're talking about self-injurious behavior because somebody has a psychiatric condition or that they're suicidal, for example. So interpersonal relations, again, we're not talking about somebody who has a personality disorder, but really that they're socially immature. They really are at risk for exploitation, that type of a deficit. And with personal judgment and decision making, it's that significant difficulty in problem solving. So for ages 3 to 5, we're looking at whether or not the child is reasonably flexible with respect to different situations, individuals amongst different individuals in the context. Can they self-initiate tasks such as accessing a snack or choosing play activities independently and with minimal prompt? Now, Be careful with this one, because self-initiating tasks or accessing snack or choosing play, if they were older, that actually would not be a good one to put in self-direction. You're probably looking at more of capacity for independent living if they were of, 6 and older. But this is more about what this is speaking to with this age is choices. Can they make decisions? It's not that they can go and get the snack. It's can they make decisions about it? Do they express interest in forming relationship with peers, engage in appropriate age-appropriate interactive play? Again, you're kind of looking at maturity level, and you're potentially looking at impact, for example, as related to autism. If left alone in a room with a peer, what's the child most likely to do? Again, for this, it's, how are they using their time? Are they crying because they've been left alone, and separation type issues, not separation anxiety to the level of a clinical, but simply that they're afraid to be alone, that kind of a thing. So that's what that's kind of speaking to there. By the time they're 6 to 12 years of age, now we're looking at, again, their ability, their flexibility to adapt to different situations. Can they adapt to that change without great distress? Can they form friendships independently? How do they react to being teased? That kind of thing. And then 13 on up, again, those demands get greater. Does the individual take the appropriate amount of medication without reminders? That one could go, and you'd have to think about it. What's driving the bus, so to speak? Is that self-direction with regard to judgment and making those kinds of decisions? Or that could also go into independent living. Because part of independent living is taking your medications, caring for your health, like if you get an injury, calling 911. So again, you have to kind of think about what function does this play, and why would it be in one particular area over another? You would be thinking about, does the individual need supervision? Are they still requiring, for example, a one-to-one aid in the school? Can the individual organize, plan, contact people for a social outing, those types of things? Can they maintain a daily schedule? How do they cope with their fears? So that's that self-soothing, that emotion regulation is what that's getting at. And here we go. Pop quiz. When Ivan was 34 months of age, he underwent a California best practice ASD assessment and was subsequently found eligible for ongoing regional center services with deficits in self-care, communication, and self-direction. Given young age and continued emerging skills, the eligibility team had recommended that Ivan undergo reassessment if warranted. Ivan, now age 6, has once more undergone a psychoeducational assessment, and you learn at a recent IEP that while Ivan continues to be eligible for special education on the basis of autism spectrum disorder, his academic needs are met within the mainstream classroom without support. Following an IPP update meeting with Ivan's mother, you begin to question whether Ivan continues to meet regional center eligibility. As previously recommended by the eligibility review team, you consult with the staff psychologist. After reviewing the new records, the psychologist determines that more information about self-direction is needed before determining whether reassessment is warranted. You are asked to contact the parent to gather more information. What questions should you ask the parent? This time you have 3 to choose from. So A, can Ivan adapt to change without great distress? B, can he self-initiate tasks such as accessing a snack or choosing play activities independently and with minimal prompts? C, does Ivan have any difficulty establishing and maintaining friendships? D, does he engage in age-appropriate interactive play with peers? Or E, all of the above? Okay, here's our poll. You'll have 30 seconds.
Okay, we got 5 seconds left. 4, 3, 2, 1, ending the poll.
And what we have this time is E, all of the above. 96% of you thought that that was the best answer. So the correct answer is D. What? I made a mistake on that. The best response is all of the above. So that actually should have been E. So that was my error. But again, remember that the intent is to explore emotional development, interpersonal relationships, personal judgment, decision-making, and choices. So those are the things that you're going to be honing in on when talking with the parent. It can also be someone, because he's 9 years of age, you could talk with Ivan, you could ask him questions, ask him how he navigates some of these things, what areas does he struggle in. So, and it could be, again, when you look at, when you're reading through an IEP or psychoeducational assessment, it may talk about these very same things, and that would help you as well. So now we're going to move to capacity for independent living. So what we're talking about here is the individual is unable to perform age-appropriate independent living skills without the assistance of another person. And so we're talking about simple household tasks. Do they have difficulty managing multiple step domestic activities? Are we talking about a lack of age-appropriate capacity to be left unsupervised? And that's as the result of safety awareness. Remember when we were talking about it before with regard to self-direction, what does the child do when they're alone? That was more about emotionally, how do they deal with this? What we're talking about here, if left unsupervised, what we're talking about is safety, as it says here, safety awareness. Significant difficulty with money management and budgeting, and difficulty taking the basic steps necessary for appropriate health services, which is, as listed here, obtaining medication refills, calling, scheduling a medical and dental appointment, remembering to take the medication. So when we're looking at someone ages 6 to 12, because remember, this isn't going to be for someone who's younger, so they have to be 6 years of age before this is counted. Here's some examples of some questions, which is really, that gets into what you're looking for with regard to the chores that they're able to do, simple meals that they can prepare, making a small purchase independently. They know what they're buying, how much it is, how much change they should have, all of those things that are preparing them. Think about it this way, preparing for independent living. We talked about safety awareness, what to do if there's an emergency. Do they know what to do in that situation? If they're 13 on up, obviously now we're talking about greater demands. Here's where a driver's license may or may not be relevant. It's not so much that not having a driver's license automatically means that you have a deficit in one of those 7 areas. It's what did they have to do in order to successfully obtain a driver's license, or what gets in their way of not being able to obtain a driver's license? So it may not just be a driver's license. It talks about here, can they use public transportation? Can they pay their bills? Again, would they be able to get out and navigate out in the community independently? If they were living alone, that's what, again, what they're working toward is that independent living. And what is their problem solving to different solutions? What would they do? Can they determine medication needs? I would, stretch that to be if they had a cut or something else happened to them medically, how would they respond to it? Do they even have house keys? Meaning sometimes it's like, well, no, I can't, give them a house key because they're always losing the house key or something of that nature. Can they schedule any personal appointments independently? That one, again, can be tricky because sometimes it's much easier, or the parent feels, well, I know what to say, I can do it, or the individual themselves can say, well, my mom or dad has always done that for me. Well, they may have, but the question is, could they do it if they lived alone? And so again, that's what you're honing in on. Back to pop quiz. Anne, age 62, recently fell and broke her hip, requiring surgery and placement at a rehabilitation facility. Staff has noticed that she is childlike and her older sister Marie is no longer able to provide for her care. Marie shared that Anne has lived with her over the past 10 years when her parents passed away. When living with Marie, Anne's chores included taking out the trash, sweeping, and keeping her room clean. Until her injury, she was independent in self-care, but she's never lived independently. Early childhood was unremarkable until she was involved in a motor vehicle accident resulting in traumatic brain injury when she was 15 years old. While she recalls her parents telling her that Anne's cognitive functioning is like a 10-year-old, Anne was never referred to the regional center. Since the traumatic brain injury, Anne has required extensive care and was in special education throughout the remainder of her academic career. Anne is unable to wash her clothes, but she does help with folding the clothes when dry. She's able to use the microwave to reheat food. However, she's unable to cook on a stove. Anne continues to have difficulty with ambulation, and she has never used public transport. Her sister schedules all of her medical and dental appointments. Marie is uncomfortable leaving Anne alone unattended for longer than 2 to 3 hours. And it was while she was running a quick errand that Anne slipped and broke her hip. Anne has never been able to budget her money, but she is able to make small purchases and obtain the correct change after transaction. Based on the following information, is there evidence of substantial disability and capacity for independent living as the result of a qualifying condition? A, yes, absolutely. B, no. Traumatic brain injury is a physical condition, which is an exclusionary condition for regional center services. Also, given her age, academic records are not available for review. Or C, I'm really not sure. Once again, you have 30 seconds.
Okay, got 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll end the poll. And here's our result.
Okay, so 52% thought that yes, it was going to be A, 10% thought B, and 38% said, I'm really not sure. So let's see what we have on this one. The correct answer is A. A is the correct response. And the reason being is while academic records would not be available, the sister appears to be a reliable reporter. Staff could also provide collateral information. And while Anne will need to undergo a formal assessment, your interaction with Anne also suggests a condition similar to, at least minimally, intellectual disability. B is not the best answer. because although the traumatic brain injury is a physical condition, it also appears to have resulted in significant cognitive impairment similar to an individual with an intellectual disability. And therefore, it's likely that she would meet the criteria for a 5th category condition. Moreover, while academic records are not available, given the history and suspected impairment, collateral information and subsequent test findings are likely sufficient to establish the qualifying condition. And C is not the best answer given the explanation I gave in A. So I wanted to include the scenario because at times we do have some elderly folks that are referred to us and we are not going to have the available records. So I wanted to point out there's other ways in order to conceptualize what this might be. And given that she was neurotypical prior to the age of 15, I would not give her a diagnosis of intellectual disability because that is something that you would have seen lifelong of that cognitive impairment. This was sudden onset because of the traumatic brain injury, and why I would default to a 5th category condition, that she is merely simply similar to somebody with an intellectual disability. So I just wanted to kind of explain that a little bit more. So let's go to our last area, economic self-sufficiency. As you can see, I have it in here in bold. This is not about money management skills. This is really about vocational training or the ability to obtain and maintain employment without significant support. So it's not just about, you know, well, I keep getting jobs and then I'm let go. It's why are you let go, right? Because there are neurotypical individuals who are unable to maintain employment, but it's not because they have a qualifying condition. So you would be focusing on if they're in vocational training, what type of training did they receive, how much support was needed. If they're currently employed, you're going to be looking at, so, you know, tell me a little bit about your job duties. What jobs have you had? How did you obtain the employment? Did someone have to help you fill out your application, that type of thing? Length of employment at each job, reason for leaving. So you have to be careful when you say, well, I couldn't fill out the application because I can't read. Well, that's a learning disability, or potentially is a learning disability. It's not because they have a condition, for example, similar to a 5th category condition. So you have to really know what is it, what's the driving force behind their inability to obtain and sustain employment. So that's really what the focus is on this. It's kind of like economics, it's kind of like mobility. It's pretty cut and dry. Mobility, you know, is that inability to ambulate because of a physical condition. Well, economic self-sufficiency is, are you able to work or succeed in vocational training? And that's all it is about. One more time, pop quiz. Stephen, age 24, was initially found eligible for regional center services at 4 years of age on the basis of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. You learn while updating the IPP that Stephen remains a picky eater. He can cook simple meals. He can further utilize the microwave and stove without supervision. You also learn that Stephen is unable to responsibly manage his Social Security funds, and your mom is the appointed representative payee. Stephen and the team are in agreement with this continued arrangement. Mom tells you that when supervised, Stephen will assist with simple chores around the home. In addition, you discover that Stephen is interested in employment opportunities, although so far he's been unable to secure and maintain employment. After some discussion, Stephen indicates that he is possibly interested in attending an adult program that will assist in the development of vocational skills. His mom expressed concerns with this plan, given that Stephen is inconsistent and has a history of starting a task and stopping to do other things. However, after much discussion, you learn that Stephen was most successful in high school when vocational support was available. Stephen tells you that he wants to check out some of the available programs and will let you know if he wants to attend full-time. Based on the following information, is there sufficient evidence to suggest ongoing substantial disability and economic self-sufficiency? Got three choices. A, no, he just needs to be provided with opportunity to make his own decisions. B, yes, it is clear that he continues to lack the necessary skills in order to live independently. Or C, yes, because Stephen has been unable to obtain and maintain employment without significant support. You'll have 30 seconds.
Okay, got 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. End of poll. And
what do we
here's
have
our
here?
result.
Okay, so this time we've got 15% thought that A was the correct answer, 35 for B, and 50 for C. So let's see what we have here. And the correct answer is C. Remember, the focus is on whether or not the individual lacks the capacity to participate in vocational training or to obtain and maintain employment without significant support. It's not about money management skills or deficits in the independent living. So with regard to Stephen, yes, he was able to participate in vocational training, but he was only successful with that support. And he's been unable to obtain and maintain the employment now as an adult, given that there's no support there. And so there is the possibility that with the right support and training, he would be successful. But he still shows evidence of substantial disability in that particular area. So we're almost home free here, guys. So where should the level of adaptive functioning be documented? First off, if we're going through eligibility, it's going to be the intake form. If it's with someone coming out of early start, I would recommend around age 30 that on the IFSP, you start thinking about Lanterman and what is it that the eligibility review team is going to need, because remember, the criteria for early start is much different for, for services. Eligibility is much different for Lanterman. It should also be documented, as I mentioned, in vendor reports. It should be another place to document it, and so that somebody could go back, especially if a redetermination is going to be needed. And it's also required on the eligibility review form that be noted on there, or the redetermination form. And then the last place would be your IPP. Final pop quiz. Abel, age 5, presents with a history of ADHD, anxiety disorder, and an elevated GAR score, which was completed by the new family physician. Abel and his family recently relocated to the United States from another country, and he speaks only limited English. It is reported that Abel assists with bathing. However, his mother insists on completing the majority of his bathing tasks. He can use a fork and a spoon, but continues to eat primarily with his hands. While Abel is able to toilet independently, he refuses to use the restroom if the door isn't open, or to use the facilities in the community and school, which has resulted in repeated toileting accidents. Based solely on the presenting information, is there sufficient evidence of substantial disability as the result of a developmental disability? You have 4 options. A, no, deficits in self-care appear to be related to psychiatric condition, such as anxiety or ADHD, which are exclusionary conditions for regional center services. B, No, I think he's just shy, and perhaps cultural factors better explain his level of functioning. C, yes, I think it does meet the criteria, and the deficits are directly related to autism spectrum disorder with deficits in self-care, learning, and self-direction. Or D, I'm not sure, more information is needed. Okay, you have 30 seconds.
Okay, we got 5 seconds left. 4, 3, 2, 1. End of poll. And here's our result.
Okay, so 13% said no, the deficits in self-care appear to be related to psychiatric condition, which are exclusionary conditions. 13% thought no, he didn't meet it because he's just shy and perhaps cultural factors better explain his level of functioning. 26% felt that yes, he did meet the criteria and the deficits are directly related to autism with deficits in self-care, learning, and self-direction. And 49% said, I'm not sure, more information is needed. So what can we learn from this? Is really the best answer is D, I'm not sure. In this particular situation, there was a lot of things that I tried to throw you guys off on, right? So potential considerations to rule in or rule out is there are cultural factors that might explain it. There is the impact of reported anxiety disorder that needs to be looked at, right? ADHD is a persistent pattern of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity, but it doesn't fully explain the presenting concerns. The other part is you would want to know about onset or change in behavior over time. And the last thing I would want to caution you about is GARS is a screener, and he's not actually undergone a formal ASD assessment. He may have autism, he may not. We wouldn't know. So again, we need a lot more information in order for someone to definitively say whether or not he meets the criteria. So I put that one in there, and again, put a lot of information in there for you to be considering, asking yourselves all of these various factors that might play a part, and why it's so important, again, to underscore the importance of collateral information, reviewing record, obtaining the records, reviewing them. When in doubt, if we don't have enough information, we need to send out either for a formal assessment or gather more information from the parent, looking at the school records. All of those particular things are all going to play a part in helping us determine whether or not someone does in fact have a substantial disability, and that substantial disability is as their direct result of a qualifying condition. So the takeaways from the training today is Lanterman eligibility is a two-pronged test, that qualifying condition and the 3 or more areas as it relates to the qualifying condition. The deficits must be substantial or significant. When I look at age equivalence, when somebody's coming out of early start, I'm looking at least a 10-month delay, or if there is a standardized assessment, I'm looking at those scores generally that are a delay of 75 or less. And the other takeaway is age matters, right? So not everybody, the different areas is dependent upon their ability is dependent upon their age, and which areas of the substantial disability are we looking at. Before the age of 6, we only have 5 areas. By the age of 6, now we have, we can add in the independent living. And then at age 16, now we can look at economic self-sufficiency. Reminder once again about communication requires deficits in both expressive and receptive. That only exception is the diagnosis. And again, it's not because of suspected autism, it is a, they have to actually have a best practice autism assessment where it's been confirmed that they have autism. And in that case, it's more about the receptive. And so you don't need both expressive and receptive. You're going to be looking more at that pragmatic deficit. As I mentioned, mobility is related to the ability to ambulate without assistance, not transportation skills. Economic self-sufficiency is about vocational training and or employment with support, not money, and you cannot double count a deficit. So it's a wrap. We now know what, who, where, when, how, why, and my last ending here, other than to say thank you, is does anyone have any questions?
There weren't any questions so far, but a couple comments. Marlene Lombardo really liked this interactive format. And Kazoo said that he thought it was very excellent use of the polls to help solidify the learning.
Good. It's difficult doing this kind of a training in this matter. I've done many trainings throughout my career. I've never done a Zoom training, and like everybody else, you play off of the audience. And so it's really hard to do it in this way, I have to say. But I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to share this information, and hope it was helpful.
There is one more question. Melissa Oldine put, would it not be a 3-pronged test, lifelong disability and prior to the age of 18 years as well?
It is. And, you know, we came up with the whole idea, we as in Anthony Hill, those of you that might have known him, we really tried to focus it on being a 2-pronged test because you have to have those two things first. But yes, Melissa, you're absolutely correct. It has to be prior to the age of 18 and it has to be lifelong, right? So all of those things matter when it comes down to eligibility. Because we do have individuals who maybe they have a qualifying condition and maybe they do have substantial disability. However, it occurred after their 18th birthday, right? Or for redetermination, we might say, well, you initially met the criteria, but it was clearly erroneous in that it's not lifelong, right? So it is more like a 4-prong test. So good point.
And there was one more. I know that it's being recorded, but I've had a couple people ask if they can get a copy of the actual PowerPoint that you used. Is that going to be posted somewhere or left somewhere?
Claire, how do you want to handle that part?
I can post it in Inside Exchange together with the link of the recording when the recording is done. So what happens is a few minutes after the webinar has ended, Zoom sends me a link of the recording and then I will post it on Inside Exchange. Then I'll add the PowerPoint presentation there.
Okay. And then like I mentioned early on, there are the actual guidelines that have much of this information with regard to prompts and the definition that's available. We'll make that available to everybody that's attended, as well as just so that you're aware, it's actually also in the J drive or the P drive. I think it's P under the clinical section. But I will also be sending this information to Claire And so that if somebody were to need it and have difficulty locating it, we can make sure that staff has that available to them. So if that's it, we're done.
Wait, we have one more.
Okay.
If medical/educational records are not available from before the individual is 18, but family can give information about substantial delays in early childhood, would they be considered for eligibility?
That's a tricky one, and it depends. Where it's, you know, we're talking about, so for example, somebody says, well, you know, my son or daughter, they had epilepsy. That's going to be really difficult, or cerebral palsy. We're really going to be looking at some medical records where somebody has given that diagnosis, and maybe we don't have it prior to the age of 18, but they have a family physician who's taken care of them throughout their life. They weren't the one that gave the official diagnosis, but they've been providing the treatment all of these years. I mean, there are ways around it. So it's not always, it's one of those things of it depends. You know, I can share with you, we did have a case of, you know, I told you sometimes we get cases where somebody is in a rehab hospital, and it's very evident that the individual, or, you know, very strong suspicion that this person has a developmental disability because of their age. We're not going to have the school records. We got lucky on one particular case. There was somebody from the school who was a school bus driver. They happened to remember the person and could give us a lot of information about what they were like when they were in school. And, you know, we would certainly do testing after the age of 18, because normally we wouldn't do any testing, because really cognitive functioning, with regard to that matter, it's prior to the age of 18. Because there could be a lot of other reasons why somebody's cognitive functioning goes down after the age of 18. But the only reason why we would do it after the age of 18 is if we have a very strong supportive evidence that it was there, and we're just needing the information to determine what is their level of functioning, and, you know, their participation in a day program, or for placement reasons. So I would never say never, but it would really depend upon what the situation was. And we'd really have to look at what those records really were pointing at.
Okay. And it looks like we have one last question from Dr. Funamura. What does SS less than 75 mean?
Oh, that's a standard score. So when there's formal testing, it can be done like in a scaled score, an age equivalent, T-score, or a standard score. And so that's what that, when you see the capital SS, that's standard score.
And then I guess maybe to elaborate more, would that mean average, below average?
You're looking more at the lower borderline. When we're looking at eligibility, we look at, you know, that normal curve with the 100 being right in the middle, and we're looking at the lower end. We're looking more toward what they refer to as 2 standard deviations below the mean, is what we're talking about when we talk about substantial disability. I will stretch it a little bit above the 75 if I look at the whole picture and boy, they're just right there and they're at 76 or 77, something like that. I don't tend to ever go past 79, because even in Lanterman with Title 17, it talks about 79 and above is really not like someone who's similar to intellectual disability. They're trending more toward low average range of abilities. So that's why it's really helpful to have that document for Title 17, so that you understand what do you really mean when you're talking about. So the very first part of that Title 17 is it really drills down to IQ scores. and it talks about the 75 and below. And then those conditions or treatment similar to, it talks about it again in Title 17 about what does that mean. So if somebody can learn something because you can break it down and simplify it or whatever, you're not talking about a condition that's similar to intellectual disability. And in one of the scenarios, folks might remember I put in there that they had a reading level. They never surpassed a 6th grade learning reading level. The reason why I put that in there is because the DSM talks about with regard to like mild intellectual disability, they're only typically able to go about to the 6th grade level. So when I start seeing scores where somebody is functioning higher than that, 7th grade, 8th grade, now I'm not really thinking that this is somebody with a condition similar to an intellectual disability. I'm thinking more learning disability.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions.
Okay. Again, thank you, everybody. It's been a long afternoon, and I really appreciate you hanging in there with me.
And you have lots of thank yous, Barbara, on the Q&A if you want to read through them.
Okay. Thanks. Will do. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much for attending. So remember, we'll be posting this in our Insight Exchange together with a PowerPoint presentation. Hope you all have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.